Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cyber Smart Conversations with Harsha. I'm so delighted to be joined today by Fred Godey, Director, Operational Technology Risk Assessment at Michael Baker International. Fred needs no introduction. From smart building expert to author to speaker, Fred has shaped and reshaped the world of building control cybersecurity. With more than 20 years of experience in secure control system development and implementation for Fortune 500 companies, Fred is one of the first in the smart building industry to address the risk that control systems technology poses. Thank you for joining. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Harsha, and thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about a subject that I really love, and I really appreciate you inviting me on to the podcast.
Great to have you, Fred. Fred, every time we connect, our discussion is always around the passion we share, cybersecurity.
Absolutely.
I really never got a chance to ask you about your career path. Would love to hear more about you and your background.
Absolutely. So it's kind of a odd way that I got into this industry. I started off in IT and did that for many years. And then around 2000, I was just kind of looking for something different. I was doing, IT stuff, admin work and that kind of thing. So a company by the name of Facility Robotics saw my resume and asked me to come in for an interview. And I'm a pretty upfront kind of guy. So when they told me this thing about building control systems and all, I was like, I don't know that you got the right guy because I'm an IT guy. And the guy said, well, actually, we do because these systems are being connected to networks and then ultimately connected to the internet. And I was like, okay, but I don't know anything about them. So I began my journey learning control systems. I first started off, one of my very first customers was Macy's. And Macy's is pretty large. And I remember going home in the evenings telling my wife, I said, well, they're probably going to fire me because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just trying to figure this stuff out. But I was also really surprised at the lack of standards, the lack of control so far as, policies and that kind of thing. But just like everybody else, I drank the Kool-Aid. So for years, I was, I like to tell people I was the problem because I helped put these systems in and I was putting them in very unsecure. And about 10 years ago, a situation arose where it really got me to thinking about how bad off are we? And I got to thinking about too, this is a pretty large attack vector, pretty large attack surface. So I started looking around for cybersecurity standards, and there wasn't any. And this was kind of concerning, but I live in Atlanta, and Georgia Tech is here, and they have a research institute, and I knew they did a lot of things with industrial control systems. So I went to them and asked, hey, can you guys help me? Because I'm trying to help design these systems better and put them, more secure. And so they introduced industrial control systems to me. And when I finished listening to them, I said, let me tell you what our systems are like. So I went through and explained that, and they said, you know what, you're not an exact fit. So even though industrial control systems and building control systems are in the same realm, they're different in a lot of aspects. And one of those is just strictly industrial control systems are a little more planned, or a lot more planned, and building control systems are pretty much left to whatever integrator happened to install it. So that's how I got into the building control cybersecurity world.
Thank you for making that choice. Industry is blessed to have you because we all learn a lot from you.
Appreciate that.
So today's topic is supply chain and operational technology. I was reading this survey done by KPMG in 2022. So 17 of Canada's biggest publicly traded and privately owned real estate organization, around like more than $160 billion in real estate assets. So they found that nearly 80% of Canadian real estate companies, they do not proactively monitor their operational technology network or devices for cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities. And like at first glance, if anyone sees, the real estate industry may seem like an unexpected target for cyber attacks, but PropTech, smart building, and other technologies have created this risk and vulnerabilities.
Mhm.
I mean, though these technologies bring significant benefits, but also expose systems to risk. And this industry is heavily dependent on vendors for operations. So to start with, let's look at what is a supply chain attack and why building owners and managers should be worried about these third-party providers.
So let's, that's a very good question. So let's take a little step back in the third party vendors. So you know how I talked about there's a culture or just the way that the building systems have been put together, and I used to be the third party vendor. So if you stop and think, if I'm a building owner and I have built, let's just say 100 buildings, and inside of that building I have 8 control systems. That means I have 8 vendors of those control systems. And I could have as many as 4 technicians from each vendor. So that's 32 vendors, right? Yeah. I mean, 32 employees of vendors. Multiply that times 100, and you got 3,200 people that are touching your systems. Okay, well, that's a large number, right? The problem is as I said, there have been no rules, guidelines of any type. And you also need to know that the facility guys, that when systems started getting introduced, they were used to running mechanical systems, and then somebody added a computer. And over the course of time, it's been the integrator or the vendor, the third party person, has become the supporter of those systems. And by supporter, I mean I've literally gone and done assessments and say, hey, I need you to log in at an administrator level so that we can take a look at your system. And they would say, well, all I know how to do is get into the web page. The vendors have had just almost total control of the systems. They even control remote access. Like we used to do this, is we would set up a system and they'd say, hey, we'd like to be able to get to it from our home. So we would either put in a router, a modem, put a public IP address in there, meaning anybody in the world could see it, or put something like Log Me In or TeamViewer, not knocking the product, but the way it's put in is me as a vendor, I would put it in and every one of my technicians would have the same username and password. So even before you address, the policies and you can't address the policies and guidelines around them because obviously there is none. The vendor has utter control of the systems. And the first thing, 3 questions I ask a building owner: do you know what you have? Do you know how it's connected? And do you know who has access? And a lot of times they can't answer any of the 3, but now you have those 3,200 people that I told you about. But there's even a bigger factor there. As a vendor, when we would let go of somebody or that person would leave, we still use the same username and password. So technicians of mine back to 1998 still knew the username and password to get into all these systems. So that number 3,200 could be as much as 10,000, depending on how many people have come and gone at those companies. I hope that kind of answers the question, but that's huge right now. That's the thing that needs to be addressed, is the building owner needs to take over control of those systems. Even though they paid for it, they don't own it yet.
Exactly. Like it's more of a process and a person problem than a technology issue. And this connects us to IT. Because there are so many articles that talks about IT OT convergence, IT versus OT. But IT has adopted a variety of practices that help them manage their cybersecurity, the supply chain risk. Like security requirements are included in the RFP and contract. So
Mhm.
building systems live in the world of OT, operational technology. But really, like what can OT learn from IT as it relates to selecting and managing suppliers?
So one of the things that IT does very well, I mean, they do a lot of things well, but one of the things, like you said, I mean, you nailed it, is they have processes and they have specifications and they have all of this stuff. Well, um, currently, currently and in the past, if you came to me and said, I want you to put in a system, an OT system, you would tell me the brand name, you would tell me what sequence of operation I would put into the system, how, that kind of stuff, but you never told me it must meet certain security requirements. Well, IT doesn't take any of that for granted. They always, if they're buying a new product, if they're if they're working with a vendor, they're going to give them guidelines. We in the OT space don't provide that. In fact, when one of the other services that we've done over the years is design review. A company will ask us to take a look at the designs. We've seen specifications that say things like must have a 56K modem. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you you haven't updated your requirements in quite some time. And so one of the things that has to be addressed is the building owner has to take responsibility for what they are specifying all the way out to what the security of that device is going to be.
Exactly, like how IT they inspect, they validate the software, and there's this secure software lifecycle development that's built in, and which OT lacks. And really to start small, like every single link in the supply chain is protected from cyber threats when it comes to IT.
Mhm.
Like the vendor software, hardware design process documented. And when we look at OT, right from the starting phase of the procurement, and even when we go on the deployment side, it doesn't end there. Once the solution is deployed in the building, like tight controls on access by the service vendors should be imposed, and make sure the vendors are authorized and escorted. Like you said, the number grows, it's 3200, but then it multiplies because you're not changing your password.
Mhm.
So, what are some of the considerations that property management team should take when assessing these vendors from a cybersecurity perspective?
So I do want to touch on something you just said that is so key, and thank you for saying it because it is something that I overlooked when I was just saying what I was saying. Is if I specify, I have to verify, right? And that is even if there's you're doing specification, I have almost 100% of the time run into there's never any follow through. There's not the recommissioning, if you will, of the system to check and verify that it was installed the way that you said. Like if you said, must use strong passwords. Well, I tell the vendor that, but I don't follow through and check to see if they actually did it. So to your point is cybersecurity is a cyclical or circle type of activity. It's never a straight line. It's not, give me this, let me check it, and then forget it. You have to continually verify. You don't have to, you can, like I've told people before, you can cyber secure yourself right out of business. Meaning you could buy all this stuff, you can do all this stuff, and you're gonna end up costing yourself more money than you make. However, there's a balance. How often do I do this? What is the risk for this building? How often should I do it? So taking that in consideration and then rolling your vendor in, you have to create an assessment process and a compliance process where that vendor is periodically checked to see, are they updating their passwords? Are they letting you know who should have access to your system? And when somebody no longer needs access to the system, they should notify you that. I'll tell you a real world case where a customer of ours, the vendor employee was let go. And studies show that if somebody's angry from being let go, they're going to do something within 24 to 48 hours. So it's really important that the vendor is required and held to this standard of notifying you when employees are left. This particular employee of the vendor was let go under bad circumstances. That night, they came in through the system, and because they only had the one username and password, it couldn't go to court that this guy did it, although they knew he did it. But he came in and he wrecked a bunch of controllers and then literally wiped out 3 servers. Well, had there been a notification process and a notification confirmation, then there's a good chance that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, you made a great statement. If you specify, you have to verify. So I think it starts from there. And so even during the assessment, we see a lot of time generic credentials and shared credentials. And we always say it's hard to maintain the audit trail, like who is on your system, who is doing what. So yes, and thank you for sharing the real life example. And do you think cybersecurity training to property management team, will it make a change? Like having we know IT, they do give cybersecurity training, but that's specific to IT. But how about doing a specific cybersecurity training for the property management team? Will it make some impact on their day-to-day operations or how they deal with these vendors?
Yeah, I mean, that's a that's a good question. That's a loaded question, and there's a lot that could be unpacked there, but I'm gonna try to keep it, a little bit tighter. So we first got to look at what the difference between IT and OT is. The National Institute of Standards and Technologies, I love the way that they define it. OT devices interact with the physical world. And then there's another thing that they have in there. It says OT devices cannot be maintained or managed like IT devices. Okay, well, fundamentally, you have to know that in order to do training, right? Because you have to realize that, I mean, not to be dramatic, but these devices, these systems have the potential to harm or kill people. IT doesn't have to deal with that. So therefore, the training has to be somewhat different, right? The other thing you have to contend with is the facility guys are inundated by alarms. I mean, there's a term we use is called alarm fatigue, because sometimes if a system reboots, it'll throw back 1,000 alarms. And yes, they just get to the point where it's like, oh my gosh, and they just quit paying attention to it. Okay, well, there was a situation, for example, if you know anything about generators have to be exercised or monthly turned on just to make sure they crank and everything works. Well, those are usually done with a schedule, or even it could be automated or somebody has to go hit a button, right? Well, a situation occurred where a generator just started running randomly. Well, there's an alarm that comes over when that generator starts to run for obvious reasons, because if the generator is running, then that means there's a problem, usually. Well, this generator was running sometime around lunch one day when it wasn't supposed to be running. And the guys were going out to their cars and saw it running, and they were going to lunch. So they looked at it and said, okay, I'll deal with it when I get back. Well, 30 minutes later, or whenever it is that they get back, the generator's not running. None of them turned it off. I don't know why they would have just left it running, but they did. Now, to be honest with you, nothing ever came of that. But when we tracked back through it, there was definite activity outside of the network that had come in and done that. Well, those are the kind of things that if you see anomalies, that you've got to do a better job of making your alarms smarter. And you got to do awareness training that don't treat anomalies as something that's just, okay, well, it's just something the system's doing squirrely. You got to teach people how to discern what the difference is. You need to work with your vendors to make your alarms smarter so that they don't just, like, for example, if you reboot a piece of equipment, have some checks in there so that they don't come in and it's a flood of 1,000 alarms. But anyway, the bottom line is, one other real world example when it comes to training. These bad guys are getting smarter. If you've heard the term phishing, there's another term, spear phishing. Well, what spear phishing is I'm directing it at you. I'm not just broadcasting a bunch of emails. There was a case where we had a guy, our customer, where he got an email and he was on the front end, the head end, the part that controlled the building, and he was using it to check his personal email. Well, he got an email and it came from one of the other employees, so he thought, and it said, hey, take a look at these pictures I took this weekend. Well, that's 100%. Somebody had done their research, figured out names of people. They probably went to LinkedIn and looked up the people that work for this particular company, and they sent that guy an email, and they used the other guy's name to make it look real. The guy clicked the link went nowhere, and he later, the guy that he thought it came from was walking through, and he said, hey man, I tried to look at those pictures you sent and I didn't see anything.
Yeah.
And he said, I didn't send you any pictures. Well, then the alarm bells goes off, but it's too late. Ransomware had been embedded on that machine and it launched itself later. But the point being is, IT will send out those phishing tests where it says, you won an Amazon gift card or whatever, just click here. But you need to be suspicious of every email. I always hover over links to make sure that it's from who it says it is and that kind of thing. It's just got to become part of your nature. But even more so than that in the OT space, because of what I said earlier, these devices can hurt you. This particular one ended up in resulting of equipment damage and with pumps and VFDs, because that's a whole nother story we could get into. But suffice it to say, there was real damage that happened and there was real risk there.
Yes, the risk is altogether different, like equipment damage, disrupt to building operations, and then eventually leading to financial loss and reputational damage.
Yes. So I'm glad you said that, reputational damage. That is something that if you stop and think about it, how do you calculate that? You can't calculate it today because tomorrow your reputation just trends off.
Exactly.
So that's another thing with IT is, yes, if it gets out that, hey, a bunch of personal information came out, that's bad and that looks bad. But what if somebody got hurt? What if somebody got killed? When I do risk profiles on buildings, the likelihood is one factor. The other is impact. And impact is for life safety, regulatory compliance, property damage, reputational damage, so on and so forth. And they're all somewhat interconnected. So yeah, to your point, it's the brand damage piece of this can be hundreds of thousands of dollars or ultimately millions of dollars, but you won't know it for weeks, months, whatever.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm going to end us off with the big picture. So if you could give one piece of cybersecurity advice to property manager that they can use today and going forward, what would it be?
And I said it earlier, but I'm going to say it again, is know what you have, know how it's connected, and know who has access. If you can just do those three things, I mean, there's obviously a lot more, but if you take those three things and go take an honest look at your systems, because almost 100% of the time we go do an assessment, every time we find stuff connected that they didn't have any idea was there.
Yes.
We find things, elevators, and notorious for this. We'll find that there's a cellular modem on, and there's external access. And then lastly, you and I talked about it, single username and password, shared credentials. So if you know what you have, you'll know how to protect it. If you know how it's connected, you'll know how to protect it. And if you know who has access, you'll know how to protect it. So anyway, it's more than one, but those are three key things that you've got to know.
Yes, because if you know what you have, so you can understand what's the risk. Because cybersecurity cannot be viewed as an IT problem only. It needs a coordinated effort to address. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And it was such an honor to have you on my podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.